So here it is, Holy Thursday and April Fool's Day. And we're also, coincidentally, this is the date of publication of the book. No one has been able to buy one before this date. And there are some that can be signed at the back before you're through, if you'd like to have one to take home in exchange for a little bit of guilt, which I think is normal practice. But tonight, I'm stalling for the cameraman.
I'm ready. You're on.
Our cameraman is Mark Meal, son of, what was your father's name?
Dr. Meal.
Who?
The veterinarian, Dr. Meal. Bill Meal. William Meal.
Oh, Bill, I knew this guy. Well, I know what happens. You will all know what happens. One night, I was here, I was introducing a speaker and talking about him, his name dropped completely. And finally he realized what was going on, and he shoved his book in front of me. And there was an outburst of laughter and applause. And I did explain after it died out, and explained to the speaker that everybody was so damn glad that it didn't happen to them. That was it. Now, running out of steam. But Mark, thank you very much for coming. And I look forward to your results. He's helped us out a number of other things. Now, our speaker tonight, author and quite a good writer, a very good writer. I've read your book. No, good writing. And we went to college, same colleges, so that helps too. But on the other hand,
class though.
the graph is there. But he has written a number of articles for magazines such as the Smithsonian, etc. This is his first book, and he became fascinated with the subject, but I don't quite know why, but he obviously has done a tremendous amount of research for it. I've read half the book, I cannot admit I read the whole book. I've read about halfway through, and the research was excellent, or his imagination is excellent. But I have a feeling, knowing the background of a lot of this stuff in England, that you have genuine knowledge of what actually was going on. And so, tonight's book, come here. I was going to call you Stewart, Doug. Come here, Doug. Okay. And I introduce you, and the floor is yours. I'm sure I should have said some other things about you, but now that we're set and I'm out of breath, he is now yours, and the audience is yours. Please,
Well, happy April Fool's Day, everybody. And it really is the publication date today, the official date of this book, which is my first book. I'm from Ipswich, and I've been writing for magazines for about 25 years. And I've written a lot of stories for Smithsonian magazine over the years, often on history and the arts. And I did a story a few years ago on the so-called authorship controversy, which is who really wrote Shakespeare? Shakespeare or somebody else? And I got more mail for that story than anything I'd ever done, which is one reason I thought of writing this book, because I think there's an unending fascination. And this is a true story. I didn't make it up, and I didn't forge it. It really is a history story, but it has a lot of the elements of a novel. It's a very improbable story on a lot of levels. It's by the way, my wife got this projector to work, and if it wasn't for that, we wouldn't be seeing anything. This is William Henry Ireland is the main character. This is William Henry in his early 20s, 1798. Despite his name, Ireland, he was English. And he was, this is a couple of years after this sequence of events. He began his career in forgery when he was 19 years old and working as an unpaid apprentice to a lawyer friend of his father. And pretended he discovered papers in Shakespeare's handwriting in an old trunk. He kept finding more and more papers, finally discovered so-called an entire unknown play in Shakespeare's handwriting that had never been published and never been performed. And it caused a literary uproar that was the sensation of the day in the 1790s in England. Not sure if it's going to carry it. This is the Ireland family lived just off the Strand in London's West End, or what was then the West End on Norfolk Street. This is Charing Cross in 1750 by Canaletto. They lived down there 4 or 5 blocks on a very fashionable residential street. His father, Samuel, was a very prosperous collector. He was a rather, I guess I'm going to have to use the cursor. Or Cookie, maybe you can see it here. And I'll just signal you. This is his father, Samuel, at about the time William Henry was born. He was a writer of travel books, which he illustrated with his own engravings. And he was also a collector of antiquarian artifacts. He collected rare books and manuscripts and other odds and ends. And this is a time in England in the late 1700s when, just hit the cursor that says, oh, hang on a second. This is going to take a second. Well, that. But actually, let me see. Well, let me try to listen. This is a time, this is just a fanciful painting of a so-called cabinet of curiosities. People in the late 1700s, prosperous gentlemen used to collect a whole sort of proto-museum in their parlors where they would have various kinds of ancient objects, as they call them, or natural curiosities. And if you've ever been to the East India Marine Hall in Salem, which is the oldest part of Peabody Essex Museum, it's a classic time warp of, it's from 1800 literally, of a cabinet of curiosity with the mahogany glass fronted cabinets, and inside there'll be a war club from Fiji and a coconut husk and a stuffed penguin and maybe a portrait or something, or a piece of statuary. And people would do this as a way to show reverence for the past, because the 18th century was a time of great nostalgia in England. People were suddenly interested, not suddenly, but many people were very interested in the Middle Ages, the tales of knights, and damsels in distress, and Chaucer, and Shakespeare. And people would go on a grand tour to England, to France and Italy, maybe chip off a piece of the Colosseum and put it on their shelf. So it wasn't considered vandalism. That was sort of showing other people that really cared about the past. Brought home a piece of the Colosseum. And Samuel Ireland had this bug more strongly than most people. He was very acquisitive, and he was very proud of his collection. And not everybody in England was a collector, and people who weren't collectors tended to not understand people who were. Often an obsessive collector could be a pretty fat target for ridicule. This is a cartoon from an Oxford University magazine in 1772 showing a bunch of collectors excitedly discussing a broken chamber pot that one of them has dug up or found. And they're really excited. And, to people who didn't collect, this was pretty ridiculous. And in Samuel's collection, he had quite a number of rarities. Often there were things from monarchs, a ring from Louis XIV, a lock of hair from Edward III, I think, a piece of a mummy's shroud. But the heart of the collection were rare books and manuscripts. The most valuable thing he owned was the first folio. He actually owned 2 or 3, maybe 2. This is the first folio was the first edition of Shakespeare's collected plays. It appeared in 1623, which is it's 7 years after Shakespeare died. And at the time, these were known to be valuable, but you could buy one for £5 in 1770. By the 1790s, when this story takes place, you could buy one for £35, which was considered a stiff price. Today, there's one in England that was stolen recently and recovered. The insurance was going to pay $15 million for it. So Samuel's very proud of this, but it still frustrated him because this is a mass-produced object. This is a book made by a printer, and there are hundreds made. In fact, the Folger Shakespeare Library today in Washington has more than 100 in its basement. What he really wanted was something unique, and specifically something in Shakespeare's handwriting. And this would have been especially exciting because nobody had ever found any of Shakespeare's papers in 1795. This is the 3rd page of Shakespeare's last will that he signed a few months before he died. This is his signature. It just says, by me, William, you can't read it. So maybe Shakespeare. And throughout this period, people all called him Shakespeare. It's very wobbly. But that's all we have. There were 4 known signatures in the beginning of the story. There's now 6. But that's it. They're all legal documents. Nobody's ever seen any first draft of any of the plays. Nobody's ever seen a poem or even a sentence in Shakespeare's handwriting, which is why some people doubt that William Shakespeare is the author of all the plays and poems. So, at this time, in the late 1700s, it's worth understanding that Shakespeare had just been deified. He had become a god by the late 1700s. This is typical of the way he would be portrayed. This was a sculpture that was, or it's a drawing of a sculpture that used to be over the entrance to the Shakespeare Gallery, which was the first art museum in England. Opened, I think, in 1786. And inside, all it was paintings commissioned of scenes from Shakespeare's plays. And that was the first art museum, which in itself is a sign of how people worship Shakespeare. But this artist gave him a muscular body, a Greek god, this sort of language pose. And this was typical. People wanted Shakespeare to be the deity they wanted him to be, regardless of the fact that nobody knew anything about him. We don't know what Shakespeare looked like. We don't know whether he was tall or short, fat or skinny. Nobody ever wrote down that. The first folio portrait was a pretty crummy piece of art by somebody who never met him. And the man who really began the cult of Shakespeare, this sort of deification, was David Garrick. He was an actor in the mid-1700s who was not a method actor exactly, but before Garrick, actors would sort of step up to the front of the stage and just, orate. They would shout their lines and not really act. Maybe the way some people think opera singers perform. He would cry on cue. He was very, he was electrifying the London audiences. And he really revived Shakespeare by, as the manager of the Drury Lane Theatre Royal, mounting 10 Shakespeare plays a year, every season, 10 different plays. Before that, Shakespeare had been out of fashion. In fact, even before Shakespeare died in 1616, he was no longer in fashion. And through the 1600s, he was mostly in eclipse. So this was a shift. This is a chair that Garrick commissioned of mulberry wood. Supposedly, from the wood of a mulberry tree that Shakespeare himself had planted in his backyard in Stratford. And this was the beginning of a sort of cottage industry of Shakespeare memorabilia. Washington Irving in the early 1800s commented that if you took all the mulberry wood souvenirs, tea chests, and all sorts of boxes and knickknacks made of this tree, you could build a warship. And that was before, and this is an ad I found at the Rare Books Library at Harvard, just a single piece of paper in an envelope. Advertising mulberry wood in 1816 in Stratford. Thomas Gibbs has by him testimonials which will indubitably prove that the wood he now offers for sale is part of the tree planted by the hand of the immortal bard. And people were making fun of this 40, 50 years before this, and they were still selling this wood, a real magical tree. So it gives you an idea of what was going on. This is a romanticized painting of Shakespeare's birthplace in Stratford. This was the first stop for any tourists who would come to Stratford, even though none of this stuff was original. If you go to Stratford today, all the furniture was acquired later because Shakespeare didn't leave behind anything. And Samuel Ireland and his son, William Henry, went to Stratford. Cookie, went to the
I can't tell if you're looking or not.
Samuel Ireland and his son, William Henry, went to Stratford in 1793, supposedly because Samuel was working on a travel book about Warwickshire, and specifically Stratford. But really, he was looking for artifacts. He was hoping to find overlooked valuables from Shakespeare's lifetime, so lots of other people hadn't already combed the town. And at one point, somebody said, "Oh, I've heard that some of his papers from one of the houses he lived in were moved out of town, the Clopton House, which is his mansion on the outskirts of town." So he rushed over there with his son, who wrote about this later. And the owner said, "Oh, you should have come to me sooner. 2 weeks ago it was. I cleared out an attic room for some partridges, and I burned up a bunch of papers in this fireplace right here. And in fact, I think I saw Shakespeare's name on some." And then he called his wife in and said, "Isn't that right, my dear?" She said, "Yes, and you will recall, I told you shouldn't burn those up. They might be of value." And so Samuel was going nuts, and he was running around the house with a lantern looking for everything, for more papers, just found partridges. And I think this is an example of something where, for his son to write about this way indicates that he understood how foolish his father was being, although he would never come out and say that. William Henry was a pretty savvy kid. He was probably 16, 17 then. And he could see how gullible his father was, and I think he took note of this. This is their neighborhood, what was then the West End. This is the Strand, which was the main shopping street. This is Norfolk Street, it is right there. Somerset House is where both the Royal Society and the Society of Antiquarians met. It was a new palace. Samuel really wanted to be invited to join, to be nominated to be a member, but they blackballed him. They wouldn't accept him because he just wasn't the right kind of gentleman somehow. He found his son, William Henry, a job after William Henry had failed in school. He had been a terrible student. One headmaster sent his father a note saying, "You're wasting your money paying tuition. Your son is so stupid, he's a disgrace to the school." And he basically flunked out of 3 schools and ended up as an unpaid clerk in New Inn, which was a campus-like enclave, built at the same time as Harvard's and Princeton's first buildings. Surrounding it were alleys where there were all these curiosity shops and used bookstalls and slaughterhouses and really dark, narrow alleys. But here it was sort of a respite. It was a very quiet place, mostly used by lawyers. And here, William Henry his father paid his lawyer friend to take his son on. The lawyer didn't really have much incentive to be teaching the boy anything, so he was never even around. The boy was alone in the lawyer's chambers, a place surrounded by, filled with old documents from the 1400s in some cases. Nobody was watching him. And he really wanted to find his father something written by Shakespeare. He started by looking in his own boss's office and didn't find anything. And then he started looking in neighborhood shops. This is Witch Street, which is as seen from the entrance to New Inn, where the camera is. This was taken in 1880. But these buildings date from Shakespeare's lifetime, early 1600s. Right after this, the neighborhood was knocked down. That's St. Clement Dane in the background, which is the church which chimes at midnight, Falstaff and Justice Swallowsbury and Henry IV. This must have been taken early in the morning, because normally this would be really crowded, filled with shops. And William Henry, like his father, knew the shops and was constantly looking for rarities. And he would actually come home with little pamphlets. Sometimes friends of his father would ask him for things. And William Henry was, like his father, really interested in the past. He practiced writing old-fashioned handwriting. This is the secretary hand, which was the handwriting that would be taught to scribes and clerks in the 1500s. So we presume maybe Shakespeare wrote this way. Of course, no one's seen Shakespeare's handwriting, so we don't know. And when he turned to forgery, it's kind of an understandable thing. He wanted to please his father. His father would say, if I could just get a scrap signed by Shakespeare, I could give away all my stuff, or half of it. But William Henry had a role model in Thomas Chatterton, who had died just before he was born, in 1770. Chatterton was a young article clerk also, an unpaid lawyer's apprentice in Bristol, who had nothing to do, and he began forging old poetry on parchment he found in the church next door. And in old-fashioned language, old-fashioned handwriting, and people who saw these manuscripts were amazed and loved it, and an earl offered to get it published, but Chatterton wanted to go to London and make his way as a writer under his own name. He tried and failed. Nobody was interested in Thomas Chatterton's writing. So at the age of 17, he drank arsenic and died. This is a very romanticized picture of his death in his attic room in London. But he became a sort of the archetypal starving poet, romanticized by Coleridge and Wordsworth, and Keats all wrote poems about him. And William Henry Ireland also was he envied Chatterton's fate, he wrote. The first thing that William Henry forged was a deed, which basically copied from a deed in his office. But he forged Shakespeare's signature above a wax seal. And this is not obviously a forgery. This is an engraving made later representing what the forgery looked like. The actual forgery had wax seals dangling on parchment strips looped through the slots in the main body of the deed. And this signature of a man named Fraser used his left hand to make it, so he wouldn't let his own handwriting be detected. It's kind of strange. It looks like a 2-year-old did it. But his father believed it when he passed it to his father one evening, and accepted it as genuine, as did his friends. But instead of being delighted, his father was pretty chilly anyway. His main reaction was, "Where did you find this?" Because wherever you found it, there must be more stuff from Shakespeare's life. The boy said he found it in an old oak chest in the mansion of an anonymous gentleman of mine we called Mr. H. And he said Mr. H did not want Shakespearean cultists laying siege to his mansion, looking for more souvenirs, so he wanted to stay anonymous. And because of the good reception, he started, moving along and trying more daring things. His father was really hassling him, saying, there's a trunk full of papers. Why are you delivering them one page at a time? All he was doing was he was working as fast as he could to write a paper to give his father. So he hit on the idea of sort of, what do you call it, reverse engineering things. So this is a page of King Lear. He found a really early edition of King Lear that his father happened to have just bought, an early sort of paperback, way before the first folio. And he transcribed it in his version of the secretary hand. And he changed things as he went. So in King Lear, there's this scene where the fool makes a lot of sort of vulgar jokes, or Kent goes on a long tear where he's using really coarse insults against Oswald. He left that stuff out. And And when people saw this, they thought, well, at last, we're seeing what Shakespeare really wrote. Instead of this sort of bad taste he often displayed, we're seeing the real gentleman, the real Shakespeare, unsullied by inept editors and conniving printers who are just trying to please the public with their gross stuff. And it's sort of like that statue of Shakespeare. One reason people believe the forgeries is the boy was creating the Shakespeare that people wanted to believe. This is a love letter. Again, this is not the original, this is an engraving. The original had an actual lock of hair from Shakespeare that he was giving to Anne Hathaway. And again, people always wondered, well, what was Shakespeare's relationship to his wife? He left her the second best bed in his will, which doesn't sound very affectionate. And people always apologize for that today. No, the second best bed, that was a good bed. I don't think so. And he lived in London. She lived in Stratford. When they got married, she was about 6 months pregnant. It doesn't sound like a marriage that should sounds like a shotgun wedding. So William Henry corrected this by writing this love letter and then a love poem that I think Don handed out to everybody. It begins, is there in heaven aught more rare than thou, sweetness of native plunder? It's kind of sing-song. But people wanted to believe it because now here's the love story that inspired the man who created Romeo and Juliet. Ophelia, that's the one, all these stories that everybody knows. Finally, William Henry went whole hog, decided to forge a complete play. He never published a poem before. I'm not sure if he's written many poems, but he went ahead and wrote an original play. And this is a version he wrote much later and he published. So the original has disappeared, all of them have. But people who saw this were really delighted. And I have to really emphasize that it was astonishing to people that the papers had disappeared. It meant that everybody had thrown out all those papers Shakespeare had written on. And he must have written a lot. He must have written first drafts. He must have had lots of poems. And for people to have thrown out Shakespeare's papers meant that they didn't recognize his unique genius. They certainly couldn't have seen him as a deity. And people were confused. They thought somebody must have put the papers away for safekeeping and forgotten where they are. They're in somebody's country manor. And so when the boy said, look what I found, their reaction wasn't to be astonished. It was, well, it's about time. We've been looking for this. This is
Question,
James.
sir.
Yeah.
How do we know that the original paper's not in a private collector's home somewhere?
Yeah. There's no way of knowing, it's true. And it remains to be seen. And I'm sure there are people that are looking. There was something in the paper today that, the original printed document about the independence of Haiti just turned up. Independence of Haiti was just discovered by a grad student in London in the National Archives. So these things turn up. But one reason people tend not to hold their breath is it's pretty rare to find Elizabethan play scripts. Partly because paper was really expensive in 1590 and 1600. Mostly it was handmade in France. And once you were through with it, once a play was set into type, you didn't need the first draft. People didn't collect manuscripts. Even in the 1700s, it was rare, which is why that cartoon was making fun of the antiquarians in the chamber club. So when you're through with a manuscript or any paper, you would have to reuse it. Maybe line a pie tin or stiffen a bookbinder. And somebody 20 years ago, I think, was rebinding an old 1588 copy of The Odyssey by Homer. And it was falling apart, so they pulled it apart. Inside the binding, they found 2 pages of a play from probably about 1588. And it looked a lot like the tavern scene in Henry IV, Part 1. So Hamlet could be inside an old, first edition King James Bible. But who's going to tear apart the Bible looking at it? Anyway, Boswell, this is, Samuel Johnson's biographer. He looked at that manuscript. I don't know how much of it he could read, but he got down on his knees and kissed the topmost page and said, I shall now die contented. that I have lived to see this day. And you have to picture the scene. The papers were only visible in the Ireland home by lamplight. It was probably pretty dark. The pages were dark. The ink was faded because it was actually watered down. People didn't know what they were seeing, but they just felt like, oh, this looks like Shakespeare. But they weren't being literary analysts. This is Richard Brinsley Sheridan. He was the most famous playwright of the day, also part owner of the Drury Lane Theatre Royal. He really wanted to stage this play, Vortigern and Rowena, which is a history play. And he competed with others and won the rights to stage it. He was deeply in debt. He had just expanded the theater. He was a gambler. He was a drunk, very flamboyant member of Parliament. And he figured, he didn't even like Shakespeare, but he figured this play, which was actually controversial. Not everyone believed it was real. People didn't know what to think, but everyone was talking about it. He figured it would fill the house night after night, and then he could pay back the expense that he spent in vastly expanding the theater, which was the biggest theater in England, with 3,500 seats. And he cast in the lead role of King Vortigern, John Philip Kemble, who was the most famous Shakespearean actor in England. This is the role that made him famous was Hamlet a few years before. And he was a very regal man, kind of pompous, and probably the closest thing in England to a living emperor. And this is Kemble in repose, quite an impressive figure. Kemble, however, even before seeing the play, was suspicious. He didn't think this sounded right. And he was a friend of Edmund Malone, who was the most famous Shakespearean editor and scholar in the 1790s. Malone knew it was a forgery right away, without looking at the papers. He just didn't give it a chance. And so it poisoned Kemble's mind, which is too bad, because he was going to play the lead role in this play. So this is Mrs. Siddon, Sarah Siddon. She was the greatest Shakespearean actress of the day. In her casual clothes. She was Kemble's sister. They often played, the king and queen together, as they would in this play. And the third lead was Dorothy Jordan. Mrs. Jordan. She was a younger actress who was not a great actress, not a great Shakespearean certainly, but she was the favorite of the gallery gods, the people sitting in the back in the cheap seats. And the theater was a place where everyone came. The theater was the mass medium entertainment of the late 1700s. Everybody went. Everybody talked about what was at the theater. They treated actors and actresses as celebrities. Unlike Shakespeare's day, where women couldn't even be actors because it was considered like prostitution to be on stage. Now she was somebody who could be quicker. This is the same role. She's actually dressed as a warrior queen. That's a military headdress, believe it or not. One reason she was so popular is she's wearing men's tights. She was famous for her cross-dressing role. This was about the only public occasion Georgian gentlemen had to see a shapely woman in tight leggings. And she was the mistress of the Duke of Clarence. And here she is studying her lines while they go on the promenade with some of their 10 children. She lived with the Duke of Clarence, one of the sons of King George III, future King William IV. And she really believed in the play. She was sure it was Shakespeare. She was delighted to be cast in the role of the king's daughter. And the Duke also believed it. He ordered 7 copies of the forthcoming bound edition of the papers, which Samuel Ireland rushed into print over his son's objections. Because Samuel wanted to make some money from these papers. And one volume was 4 guineas, £4, 4 shillings, which is about what a working man earned in 2 months. He bought 7. He ended up leaving her, by the way, and the 10 children, marrying a princess from the continent before he became king. This is the poem you have. Is there in heaven aught more there? And it's a little hard to see what it says. This is from the miscellaneous papers, which is what Samuel called the book he brought out. in Christmas time, 1795. And hundreds of people bought it. The Prime Minister bought a copy, earls, dukes, bishops, all sorts of dignitaries. And it's worth understanding that what a critic or a scholar thought was a lot less important to the average Englishman or Englishwoman than what the aristocrat thought. So if a duke said, I think this is real, that carried a lot of weight, even though it seems kind of silly to us today. This is the example of what you have. And actually, even though it seems silly, to say there on earth a man more true than literally Shakespeare is to you, it's actually pretty hard to detect forgery just on stylistic grounds. And look at the Hitler diaries, where you had examples of Hitler's handwriting and his writing, and experts testified it was authentic. Or the Howard Hughes hoax in the 1970s. There are lots of examples of what Howard Hughes wrote, and people weren't sure. And with Shakespeare now, there's still arguments going on about anonymous sonnets that were printed in, say, 1600. And people look at them and they feed them through computer programs to study the verb patterns, and there's no way to know. You can't just look at something and say, it's sheer genius, it must be Shakespeare, or it's boring, it couldn't be. Because has anyone here ever read The Rape of Lucrece by Shakespeare?
Which
It's
one?
an epic poem. He was better known for his epic poems than for any play while he was alive. And it's tough going. It really is. It's long-winded, it's sensational. It's about the prelude to a rape and the aftermath of a rape. It was very popular. It sold really well. And I tried to read it. I couldn't. I got the book on tape with Richard Burton reading it, which made it worse. But I think sometimes we talk about Shakespeare unthinkingly, about how great he is, as though there's something in each verse that just jumps out at you. So that's a way of defending a forger. I mean, people later wrote about this as silly, but they're writing after they knew the boy had confessed. At the time, it was pretty tough to know, and it was also dangerous for a critic to come out and denounce papers that might later prove to be Shakespeare's. That would not only be embarrassing, it would be a sacrilege, it would be blasphemy, because you would have denounced a god. So people mostly kept their heads down. This was a critic named James Bodden, the editor of a newspaper called The Oracle, reading that poem that was there in heaven on where he said he detected the utmost of delicacy and poetical passion. So he regretted that. And not one group of people that weren't worried about sticking their necks out for newspaper editors in general. So there were a number of parodies published before things had come to a head and there was still complete uncertainty. This was actually a critic named Richard Porson. Published this as a letter to the editor in one of the morning newspapers in London in 1796. He signed himself S. England instead of S. Ireland, in case people didn't get the joke. And he said he had just discovered the lost tragedies of Sophocles, a little trunk. And he published them. There's the art in Greek, this one stands up. And here it is translated in Latin. And I don't speak Latin. It's Las glaci durata triplice fuere fuenta. It says, 3 children sliding on the ice, one fell in. That's another loose thing. It's sort of a nonsense nursery rhyme. But it's pretending Sophocles wrote it. So. But people didn't really care. It was people made fun of it. But the newspapers were always like today in England. They made fun of anybody. They would trash someone just for being Catholic, or for visiting France. This was one critic, one of the 2 main Shakespeare critics. This is George Stevens, and he knew without looking that the plays and the papers were forgeries. And he spread the word, but he wasn't about to put his own name on it. And he influenced some other critics who started to ask questions. But the villain of the story, even though he was right, but certainly the bête noire of the Ireland family was Edmund Malone. And he dropped what he was doing. He was supposed to be working on a biography of Shakespeare. It was going to be the biography. He never did write it. Partly because he threw himself into about half a year of analyzing these papers, and then finally published a page expose. It was supposed to be a pamphlet, it kept getting bigger. And he published it 2 days before the premiere of the play. This is Malone's edition of Shakespeare's complete plays, published in 1790. He also has Greek and Latin, in case you're wondering if he's a learned man. He's very learned man. His readers are learned men. And just 6 days, 5 or 6 days after this book, by the way, was published in the winter of 1796, which included this forgery. It's an acknowledgement of a payment of £5, a repaid debt from Shakespeare. John Hemming, his friend and fellow actor. William Henry, again, wrote it with his left hand. It looks like a pile of string. And then 5 days after this was published for everyone to see, a neighbor and friend of the Irelands discovered a deed with the 5th signature of Shakespeare ever found and the 1st signature of John Hemming ever found. And you go back to it. Okay. Well, anyway, it's very regular, like calligraphy. No, it's okay. Yeah. I mean, there's no connection. So the neighbor ran up to the Ireland and said, the papers are a forgery, I can tell. Look at this, they don't match. And if one paper was a forgery, they were all a forgery. And William Henry came up with a story. He said, oh, that's, Mr. H says that's tall John Hemmings. You're thinking of short John Hemmings. There were 2 John Hemmings, both knew Shakespeare. And people bought it because they saw what they wanted to see. They wanted to believe the papers were real. And they wanted to believe that Shakespeare loved his wife. They wanted to believe he paid back a debt to a friend in exactly 30 days, even though the idea that 2 friends, one borrowing £5, would like write a little, accounting thing about this £5 loan. This is the Drury Lane Theatre after its expansion. And theatre audiences, the 2 days before the premiere is when Malone published his 400-page book. I don't think too many people, even though the 500 copies sold out in 48 hours, I don't know how many people read it in that time. Malone was not a popular guy. He was a monarchist. He was scathing in the tone of his expose. So if you read it, you think it's not the most persuasive thing in the world. But also, people looked at the theater in 1796 as a public space. It was so popular that when the theaters would raise their prices, it was considered a tax increase because everybody went. And every 8 or 10 years, there'd be a theater riot when they try to raise the prices. And people go through and smash all the furniture and tear everything. And there are whole books written about this. The audiences believed that they were the sovereigns. And they would decide if the play was Shakespeare or not. It would be a trial by fire. And Sheridan knew this, and that's sort of the proper thing. A critic was somebody who, like Malone, saw his job as to be to protect the newly literate English population from dangerous writings. Because suddenly there were all these explosion in printed matter of literacy increased, and you could read all kinds of seditious stuff. And he thought he was this gatekeeper. And a lot of people really resented that. And he thought, who are you to tell us what to believe? So I don't want to go into too much detail about what happened next. This is the Drury Lane Theatre in 1787, giving you an idea of what the audience is like. They weren't necessarily that attentive. It was a little bit like a party. There's a scene in Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen where Elizabeth Bennet goes to the theatre in London when she's visiting her aunt. And they're talking, and you realize in the scene, they're in the theater, the play is underway, and they're having this animated discussion. That's what people did. They bring their dogs, they eat, they flirt. Sometimes they used to have sword fights. Back in the days when men routinely wore swords, they didn't by this time. So it was a tough crowd, and it was a tough crowd for anybody. Even Sheridan's first play stopped in the middle when people were throwing things at the cast. They had to go back and rewrite it. Sometimes it would get to this point. This is 30 years later, but it's a great picture. They're all trying to get into their head. So, I don't want to give away the ending, but if you've ever looked, the name of the play was Vortigern and Rowena. If you look in any edition of Shakespeare's complete works, you won't find it, which is an indication that he doesn't get away with the hoax, in case you're wondering how this ends. But I don't want to tell you exactly what happened, but a few years later, William Henry published a confession, but it wasn't an apologetic confession. He had been praised as a second Shakespeare, and it had gone to his head, and he really believed that he was a great writer, and he was hoping that people would be delighted that this young man with a whole career ahead of him was writing like Shakespeare. And he wasn't sure what was going to happen with his father, who was the real butt of this hoax. And again, the tortured relationship between this boy and his father is the heart of the story, because to try to curry favor with his father by making him the target of a hoax was kind of twisted. And there's no way it was going to end well. The boy painted himself into a corner. And if he reveals that it's all fake, and his father becomes a laughingstock. So it did not end well. But this was a very boastful confession. He went on, this is 1832, he was about 50. Or actually 1825, he lived another 10 years. He became a writer, writing what he wanted to write. He wrote Gothic novels, very kind of lurid, overwritten novels, which were very much the fashion in the early 1800s. And some of them were actually quite successful under his own name. But he didn't have the career he had hoped to have. You know, he thought he was a second Shakespeare, and he really wasn't. When he was writing like Shakespeare, he was borrowing things from the plays, like Macbeth and Hamlet. He knew the language because everybody knew Shakespeare, and it was kind of a pastiche. In one case, our critic had said, I don't think that Shakespeare was not trashy enough, because people were used to all the sexual innuendo and insults and sort of slapstick, and he didn't have that, so the critic was thinking, it's not bad enough. Anyway, he finally, the first thing, in the first years, the main way he was able to make a living was actually making forgeries of his forgery. People would come to him and say, you still have a copy, do you still have that forgery of the love letters? And he'd say, no, but I can make one. At one point, and later, one reason people haven't heard about this young man, I'm convinced, is because later people wrote about him as this compulsive liar. He couldn't stop himself from lying. He made forgeries or forgeries. Well, he had to. Nothing else would sell. People would say, do you have a letter with the lock of hair? Give me a week. And just before he died, he published Wardigan under his own name. I don't think it sold very well. But I think the moral of the story is that your heart tells your eyes what they're seeing, or your brain. It's a case of wishful thinking, or the emperor's new clothes. A lot of this is you're in a group and you believe what the group believes. But what did people really know about Shakespeare? And when some people said a boy should be hanged, and he didn't actually commit a crime, he said it's the critics that should be hanged because they were the real imposters. They were pretending to be experts on Shakespeare, not Malone, but all these other people who later denounced him. And he said, they're supposed to be experts. Obviously, they don't know anything about Shakespeare. Because I was writing this, beginner stuff that he later realized wasn't so good. And they were saying, this is either from Shakespeare's pen or from heaven, stuff like that. So he became pretty big. I think that's the end. Yeah. Okay. Well, any questions? Because maybe I'll talk longer than I think. Yes.
What is considered the first official or authentic biography of Shakespeare? That is generally considered.
Yeah. I think it's Rowe, R-O-W-E, in the early 1700s. But what Rowe did and others is collected legends. So things like that Shakespeare poached deer in Stratford and went to London because the king's men were after him. And that's just a made-up story. There's no evidence for it. And in fact, somebody in the mid-1700s actually went to Stratford and surrounding towns trying to gather information couldn't find anything in 1750. And he was one of the first people to privately suggest that Will Shakespeare couldn't be the playwright. And then there were later things. I mean, Malone was going to write a really thorough biography, but he never got around to it. And lots of biographies, they come out every year, but they're not really biographies because there's just too many gaps. I know when Stephen Greenblatt wrote Will in the World, he's a famous English professor at Harvard, and Will in the World got on the bestseller list 5 years ago or 6 years ago. And the New York Times Book Review editor wrote, you know, I'm not sure if this belongs on the fiction or the non-fiction bestseller list. Because if you look at any of these books that would have, should have, must have known about, surely knew that, probably, you know, it's all speculation. So, as far as a real biography, there are none. I think that's the best answer. Yes?
Obviously, there weren't any laws in the English legal system that punish you for fraud or property value.
There were, but he didn't profit from this. And when the play actually was performed, Sheridan was at first excited, then later when he sat down and read the play, a month later, after seeing the manuscript, he was struck by how unpoetic it was. But he didn't think it was a forgery. He decided it was probably a very young Shakespeare who had written it. But when he finally produced the play at Drury Lane in 1796, he left Shakespeare's name off the playbill. So the posters for the play, everyone knew it was a Shakespearean production. That's why it was the first full house the theater had ever had. That's why everyone talked about it. Thousands of people were turned away. There were a mob outside. You couldn't get within 2 blocks of the theater because everyone knew it was supposed to be Shakespeare, but it wasn't officially Shakespeare. And the boy never made any money on it. But earlier in the century, forgery has become a capital offense. Because paper money had just been introduced around 1700, 1699. And there were a lot of people forging money, and they were getting hanged every year. And in fact, William Henry didn't make his own ink. He didn't take ink and add water. He did that first, for the very first attempts. He took it to a binder's shop right next to where he worked. He was very open with what he's doing. It's amazing. And a young man in the bindery shop, a journeyman, said, well, that doesn't look good. Let me give you some ink. And he mixed 3 kinds of acid and froth. And he said, that'll be a shilling. Well, William Henry Ireland wasn't the first person to walk into that shop planning to make a forgery. And the century's been called the age of forgery. But to do what he did wasn't technically a crime. Some people thought it should be. And I think today, if you were to forge Shakespeare, I'm not sure it would be a crime. I think it would be. It definitely would be. Yeah. And I think one thing is, well, any other questions about Shakespeare or William Henry Ireland? Okay. Thank you.